ladies and gentlemen, this is your king, George III. Welcome to Hamilton.
I'm that guy who, whenever I see something that is based on a true story, I want to know what exactly is the true story. So today, we're going to take a look behind the curtain of Hamilton. Hamilton has been a cultural sensation since it debuted on Broadway in the summer of 2015. For 5 years, it has been the most difficult and expensive ticket of any show on Broadway. Stagings in cities like Chicago and Atlanta, and the bus and truck version that toured cities like Nashville, where I saw it in December of 2019, sold out in minutes. It turned out that the only thing that could stop this musical juggernaut was a global pandemic, but not before grossing more than $1 billion around the world. But all that acclaim has not been without its downside. While generally praised for its multi-ethnic cast, the only character played by a Caucasian male is George III. The play has been criticized in some circles for being a white man's version of American history as told by people of color. And since the streaming on Disney Plus began, there has been a backlash directed at the play's apparent failure to address the presence of slavery in America's founding. This being the age of social media, it's no surprise that in the week after it began streaming, the controversy has even produced its own hashtag. One historian questioned the show's unusual casting, wondering why no actual historical people of color could find a place in Hamilton's narrative, observing that while the cast was overwhelmingly diverse, the characters being portrayed on stage are universally white. The criticism is not entirely without merit, and Hamilton creator Lin-Manuel Miranda has faced it head-on, acknowledging in a recent tweet that the true story of our nation's founding and the lives of the men and women who, as the Schuyler sisters sing, were lucky to be alive then, were as complex as the times they lived in. I will now attempt to do in about 20 minutes what Lin-Manuel Miranda wasn't able to do in 6 years and 2.5 hours. So let's take a look at the role these founders, these revolutionaries, had in what one later statesman would call America's peculiar institution that was forged into the nation's fiber, the contradiction that has dogged America since John Hancock first adorned the Declaration of Independence with his ornate signature. Perhaps the closest Hamilton comes to addressing the issue of slavery comes early in the second act. Given the machine gun pacing of the lyric, you'd be forgiven for missing it. In the first of two cabinet rap battles, Thomas Jefferson, acting as the Secretary of State but speaking on behalf of the Southern states, makes his case in opposition to Hamilton's plan to consolidate the 13 new states' debts in order to obtain international credit. Here we see clearly drawn the differences between the northern and southern states and the issue that has defined America since her conception.
The shoe fits wear it. If New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Our debts are paid, I'm afraid. Don't tax the South, cause we got it made in the shade. In Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. We create. You just wanna move our money around.
And Hamilton replies with a retort that seems obvious.
A civics lesson from a slaver. Hey neighbor, your debts are paid because you don't pay for labor. We plant seeds in the South, we create, they keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting.
Yep, that's the issue. So let's take a look at the individuals portrayed in this epic musical and see what we can learn about the role of slavery in their actual lives. The two acts of Hamilton divide roughly between the era of the Revolution in Act 1 and the consolidation of the new Union in Act 2. For Act 1, I'm going to discuss the characters as they appear on stage. In Act 2, we will proceed along more constitutionally chronological lines. The first character on stage is Aaron Burr. Burr served with distinction as an officer in the Continental Army during the Revolution. After the war, he served in the New York State Legislature, was appointed to the United States Senate for one term from 1791 to 1797, and he was the third Vice President of the United States during Thomas Jefferson's first term from 1801 to 1805. And yes, Burr was the damn fool who shot him. Aaron Burr lived most of his life in New York City and kept several enslaved men and women on his household staff. To his credit, he insisted his servants be well educated. As an attorney, Burr represented clients on both sides of the issue. In one case, he represented freed slaves trying to establish property rights. Though he was known to support abolition, he also proposed strict limits on the right of freed blacks to vote, to serve on juries, or to testify against whites. But he fought a statute that would have penalized interracial marriage. These inconsistencies are precisely consistent with Burr's portrayal on stage as a duplicitous and principle-free operator. The next character who appears in the opening number is John Laurens, who is portrayed in Ron Chernow's biography, Alexander Hamilton, as Hamilton's closest friend. Laurens may be the most intriguing character in the entire lineup. He may have been the most ardent abolitionist of all the major characters in Hamilton. While it is arguable that he never personally owned slaves, he was in fact raised in a life of Southern wealth and privilege and was heir to one of the largest plantations in South Carolina. He was educated in Europe and studied law in 1774 at a time when anti-slavery sentiment was beginning to take hold in England. As the play infers, Laurens' most sincere ambition was to recruit as many as 3,000 slaves to serve in the Continental Army, with the promise that they would be granted their freedom at the war's successful conclusion. Unfortunately, as the play also portrays, Laurens was killed in a senseless skirmish with British troops almost a year after the Battle of Yorktown, becoming one of the last casualties of the American Revolution. His hopes for a free black battalion died with him. Now we come to Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier, known to posterity as the Marquis de Lafayette, and brilliantly portrayed by the high-velocity rapper Daveed Diggs. What about Lafayette? Despite his life in France as a wealthy, landed aristocrat and military officer, Lafayette believed fervently in the principles of small r republican, small d democracy. Lafayette was a staunch abolitionist, thanks in no small part to his own close friendship with John Laurens. However, Lafayette advocated that emancipation proceed slowly so as not to disrupt those economies that depended on enslaved labor. To demonstrate his ideas for ending slavery, in 1785 Lafayette acquired a plantation in the French colony of Cayenne in South America. To his credit, Lafayette was a relatively benign master. He forbade the use of the whip, provided the enslaved with an education and more family time, and discontinued any further trade in human chattel. Nevertheless, for so long as he owned that plantation, Lafayette did indeed own slaves, albeit as a slave owner who believed strongly in emancipation and showed a willingness to bear that expense. After Lafayette, the next character to appear on stage is Elizabeth Schuyler, known as Eliza, along with her sisters Angelica and Peggy. The Schuyler sisters portrayed on stage were 3 of the 5 daughters of Philip Schuyler, a wealthy landowner from Albany, New York, who served as a general in the Continental Army during the Revolution. Philip Schuyler was heir to one of the oldest Dutch families in New York. His family lived in a mansion in Albany, and he kept a country estate in Saratoga Springs that produced flour, flax for linen, and lumber. Contemporary reflections on the subject compel us to believe that slavery was mostly confined to the southern colonies and states, but a visit to the Schuyler mansion teaches us that slavery was an integral component of the Dutch and English colonial economies throughout the world. Records show that between 8 and 13 enslaved men, women, and their children served at the Schuyler home. After the Revolution, General Schuyler expanded the Saratoga property with the addition of as many as 30 slaves that worked alongside tenant farmers. It will be important to note here that in his correspondence, Schuyler often refers to these enslaved workers in more genteel terms as the servants. While the practice of slavery continued into the 19th century, the slave trade was banned in New York in 1788. In 1799, New York adopted an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And in 1827, slavery in New York was outlawed entirely, but even then, many slaveholders found ways to keep their former slaves indentured. Philip Schuyler had no male heirs, so his estate would have fallen first to his eldest daughter, Angelica, and all of the Schuyler sisters would have been raised by and grown familiar with enslaved black men and women in their households. Given what we will learn about Hamilton later, it is safe to say that the Schuyler family continued to own slaves well into the 19th century. Now we get to the big guns, the three presidents who are actually portrayed on stage in Hamilton. A fourth gets a mention but never appears, which is unfortunate, because John Adams was the only one of the first 5 presidents who never owned a slave, and only one of 2 of the first 12 presidents who were not slaveholders, the other being his son John Quincy, who was the 6th president from 1825 to 1829. George Washington inherited his first 10 slaves on the death of his father in 1743, when George was all of 11 years old. Through inheritance, purchase, and his marriage to Martha Custis, Washington's slave holdings grew by orders of magnitude over the course of his life. After the Revolution, Washington became skeptical of slavery on both moral and economic grounds and expressed support for gradual abolition. He expressed that view often, but rarely in public, lest he run afoul of his political allies in Virginia and the other southern states. At one point, more than 300 men, women, and children lived enslaved lives at Washington's Mount Vernon estate on the Potomac River in northern Virginia. At the time of his death in 1799, only one of those servants, his personal valet, was granted immediate freedom. The remaining 100-some slaves would not earn their freedom until his widow Martha followed George up to that great plantation in the sky. There were complications due to the inherited origin of some of those slaves, but in all, more than 160 were eventually freed, making George Washington the only one of the founding fathers to free his slaves. Of all the slave-holding presidents, perhaps none is as perplexing as Thomas Jefferson. It has been said often that America is an idea. That idea was established in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. But it pretty much goes without saying that Jefferson wrote those words even while holding hundreds of enslaved Africans at Monticello, his plantation in central Virginia. Less well known is the fact that Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration included a clause that accused the King of England for waging, quote, cruel war against human nature itself by violating the sacred rights of a distant people, carrying and captivating them into slavery, end quote. But this attempt to hold George III to account for the practice of slavery in the American colonies was excised before the Declaration was adopted on the 4th of July in 1776. Thomas Jefferson was known as a diligent record keeper, and those records show that Jefferson owned more than 600 slaves over the course of his life and freed a total of 2 of them while he was living and only a handful more after his death. The slave trade in America was outlawed in the last year of Jefferson's second term, and his attitude towards slavery evolved over the years. Like other Southern planters, he advocated the gradual elimination of slavery and was dead set against its westward expansion as new states joined the Union. But as the Union grew and slavery became ever more contentious, his attitudes hardened. And with the Missouri crisis in 1819, he argued for the expansion of slavery into the lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. In a letter written that year Jefferson said of the intractable questions of slavery, "We have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor let him go." And then, of course, there's the whole Sally Hemings business. Alas, time does not allow. All that can be said now is that 2 of Sally's children were allowed to escape their captivity, and 2 others were freed in Jefferson's will. Unfortunately, Thomas Jefferson died deeply in debt, and the remaining 130 slaves at Monticello were sold off to relieve some of that burden. James Madison was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson and served as Secretary of State through both of Jefferson's terms, succeeding him to the presidency in 1809. And like Jefferson, James Madison was a Virginia planter in the 18th century. So, Madison's estate, called Montpelier, was about 30 miles away from Jefferson's Monticello, and that proximity factored in their lifelong friend and mentorship. As Jefferson is remembered as the author of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, so Madison is remembered as the principal author of the Constitution in 1787. Together, Jefferson and Madison could arguably be considered the principal architects of whatever the hell it is we're living with today. Like Washington and Jefferson before him, James Madison owned hundreds of slaves, and like other of his contemporaries, his attitude on the subject were decidedly mixed. This is, after all, the man who consented to the 3/5 provision, whereby the institution of a slavery was effectively enshrined into the Constitution. But the contradictions of black slavery in a white republic were not lost on Madison. When Madison went to Philadelphia to serve in Congress in 1797, he brought with him an enslaved manservant named Billy, who hoped that Madison might grant his freedom. Prohibited by Pennsylvania law from selling Billy, but not wishing to return to Virginia with him, Madison lamented in a letter to his father that he could not think of punishing him by transportation merely for coveting that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood and have proclaimed so often to be the right and worthy pursuit of every human being. Nevertheless, when taking residence in the White House from 1809 to 1817, Madison and his wife Dolly not only brought slaves from their Virginia plantation, they also leased the services of other enslaved laborers from slave owners around the District of Columbia. Back home in Virginia, one historian described Madison as a garden variety slaveholder, following the established norms for treatment and living conditions, expecting field hands to work from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Dolly Madison had been raised in a Quaker family. Her father had emancipated his own slaves after the Revolution, but apparently Dolly did not share her father's convictions. Where Washington and Jefferson had freed at least their manservants upon death, Madison didn't even do that. Paul Jennings, the man who wrote that he was with Mr. Madison till he died and shaved him every other day for 16 years, remained enslaved even after Madison's death in 1836. Other enslaved servants from the Madison estate continued to be sold to ease the financial burden on Dolly Madison until her death in 1849. Finally, let us look at the role of slavery in the life of our titular character. What's his name? Alexander Hamilton. Of all the characters in this American musical, when it comes to the issue of slavery, Alexander Hamilton's role is perhaps the most difficult to pin down, and thus uniquely embodies the quandary this issue has posed for more than 200 years. It would be great if we could say that Alexander Hamilton never personally owned any slaves, which would make him one of the few founding fathers exempt from the legacy of bondage. But obviously he did have connections to slaves and slaveholders throughout his life. First, while demonstrating his prodigious talents as the teenage manager of a St. Croix trading company, Hamilton did engage in the slave trade with Africa. And when he married Elizabeth Schuyler in 1780, he became part of a wealthy and powerful family that did own slaves, and perhaps drawing on his experience in St. Croix, turned a blind eye toward the buying and selling of slaves for his in-laws. As much as we may want to absolve Hamilton, there is some evidence that he did own at least one slave while serving as Washington's right-hand man during the Revolution. There are in the archives several letters written by Hamilton during the Revolution which make reference to his servant. And we know from the correspondence referenced earlier from Philip Schuyler that the term servant was often used in the 18th century as a polite euphemism for slave. Furthermore, Alexander Hamilton's grandson, Allan McLean Hamilton, wrote in a biography of his grandfather that, quote, "It has been stated that Hamilton never owned a Negro slave, but this is untrue. We find that in his books there are entries showing that he purchased them for himself and others," close quote. And contrary to the common assumption, there is scant evidence in his surviving papers to suggest that Hamilton was indeed much of an abolitionist. So it's hard to say. I guess it just depends on who's telling the story. The final number in the musical Hamilton asks that question: who tells your story? And the answer is Eliza. Eliza Hamilton lived 50 years after her husband was mortally wounded on the dueling grounds in Weehawken, New Jersey, and she did indeed put herself back in the narrative. She compiled her husband's papers. She interviewed countless colleagues and comrades in arms. With Dolly Madison, she raised money to build the Washington Monument. And 2 years after her husband died, she and 2 other women started the Orphan Asylum Society in New York. In that final number, Eliza sings to the ghost of Alexander.
I speak out against slavery. You could have done so much more if you only had time.
But sadly, there is scant evidence that either Alexander or Eliza did much during their lives in the cause of emancipation. When Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton died in 1854, at the age of 97, she was the last living link to the Revolutionary era. What we can take away from this is how inextricably slavery was woven into the fabric of the new nation. Not even the most strident advocates of abolition were immune to the influence and effects of this peculiar institution. In the week before the filmed version of Hamilton began streaming on Disney+, Lin-Manuel Miranda spoke to NPR's Terry Gross about the controversy that nags at the edges of one of the most successful artistic endeavors in history.
Slavery is the original sin of this country. It's in the third line of our show. It's a system in which every character in our show is complicit in some way or another. Hamilton, although he voiced anti-slavery beliefs, remained complicit in the system. He didn't really do much about it. None of them did. None of them did enough.
Now you know the rest of the story. From Jefferson's promise, to Lincoln's deliverance, to Martin's dream, Hamilton, this most American of musicals, reminds us of the unresolved paradox that has defined America since its founding.